I woke up to silence that didn't make sense. A silence so heavy it pressed against my chest harder than the tubes and wires taped to my skin. The first face I searched for wasn't there. No mother holding my hand. No father sitting stiffly in the corner pretending he cared. No sister pacing nervously by the window. Instead, I was surrounded by the cold hum of machines and the stale air of a hospital room that smelled of bleach and abandonment. Later, a nurse whispered to another, not realizing my ears were awake before my body, that my parents had signed the papers and left. Left me in a coma. Left me to survive, or not, on my own. Imagine opening your eyes after weeks of darkness and finding out that the people who brought you into the world had walked away when you needed them most. I stared at the IV drip, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of how family could vanish the moment love required effort. I thought back to the last conversation I had with them, the sharp edge in my father's voice, the way my mother avoided my eyes, and I realized the truth. My accident had been less an unfortunate event for them and more an inconvenience they wanted erased. That knowledge burned through me hotter than the pain in my body. I knew then, as sure as the monitors beeped, that when I stood again, it wouldn't just be to walk, it would be to face them, and one day, to confront them where they couldn't. Escape the truth. In court, the doctors told me it was a miracle I survived, that most people in my condition wouldn't have pulled through. But what they didn't understand was that my survival had nothing to do with luck or medicine. It was pure stubbornness, a refusal to let my parents' decision be the last chapter of my story. I lay in that hospital bed listening to fragments of conversations around me, piecing together what had happened while I was gone, and the picture that formed was uglier than I could have imagined. My parents hadn't just left me because they were scared or overwhelmed. They had walked out because they didn't want the burden of bills, of responsibility, of sitting through endless nights unsure if I'd ever open my eyes again. They had decided my life wasn't worth the inconvenience. Nurses told me they signed discharge documents when I wasn't even stable, tried to move me to a facility that would cost them nothing. But when the paperwork bounced back, they simply disappeared. Strangers cared for me, bathed me, whispered encouragement I couldn't answer, while my family was busy living their lives as if I no longer existed. I remembered the way my mother used to braid my hair when I was little, how she told me I was her miracle baby, and I wondered how easily she had turned those words into dust. I thought about my father, a man obsessed with appearances, who used to remind me every time I failed to meet his impossible standards that I was too much to handle. Maybe he finally meant it. In those long nights when sleep came in broken fragments, I promised myself I would get stronger, not just for me, but so that when the day came, I could look them in the eye without trembling. I didn't want revenge through violence or cruelty. What I wanted was justice, for the truth to be seen under the brightest light, for them to be exposed for who they really were. I learned how to walk again, each step pulling fire through my muscles. But every win, every regained movement felt like sharpening a blade I would one day carry into battle. The hospital became my training ground, and the nurses, the only family. Who didn't run? I refused to cry where anyone could see me. I turned my tears into fuel. And with each milestone, I knew I was moving closer to that courtroom where my parents thought they'd never have to face me again. They believed I was gone, erased, a problem neatly buried. But I was alive. And soon, they would find out just how dangerous it is to abandon someone who refuses to stay silent. Rehabilitation wasn't a straight line. It was agony stretched into days and weeks that felt endless. But my determination was louder than the pain. I remember the first time I tried to sit up on my own, how my body trembled like a leaf in the wind, how sweat poured down my face as if my body itself was resisting life. The physical therapist crouched beside me, repeating over and over that I could do this, that I had to push past the fear, and I clung to her words because they were the only encouragement I had. My parents never visited, never sent flowers, or even a card. The nurses said maybe they were too traumatized, maybe it was too hard for them to see me like that, but I knew better. Trauma doesn't keep you from your child's bedside. Indifference does. When I was strong enough to hold a pen, I began journaling, writing letters I would never send, to remind myself of every detail I couldn't afford to forget. I wrote about how they signed those papers to release me, about how they acted as if I was already dead, about how they continued their lives without once looking back. I found out my father had been bragging at his office about focusing on his real priorities now that he didn't have to deal with me. My mother, I learned, had gone on a vacation with her friends within weeks of leaving me behind, and when I finally regained access to my phone, I scrolled through messages and saw no missed calls, no texts, not even a single inquiry about whether I had survived. It was like they had erased me from the family completely. That realization broke something in me, but it also rebuilt me differently. I started keeping records, asking nurses to document every step of my progress, collecting medical files and financial statements that showed just how they abandoned me when the hospital expenses rolled in. I didn't tell anyone why I wanted copies of everything. I just said I wanted to understand. But deep down, I was building a case, brick by brick, without them knowing. In therapy sessions, when my voice cracked talking about being unwanted, my therapist told me I wasn't alone. That some families abandon the very ones who need them most because facing their own reflection in suffering is unbearable. I nodded, but I was already planning ahead, envisioning the moment I would stand in front of them. Not as the broken daughter they tried to discard, but as the survivor they could no longer ignore. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about forcing them to acknowledge what they had done, dragging their secrets into the open where their polished image would shatter. And so I pushed harder, walking longer distances, relearning how to eat without assistance, sitting through legal consultations with my therapist's help, because I knew this wasn't going to end in whispers. One day it would be a courtroom, full of people, eyes on us, and they would finally have nowhere to hide. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, I didn't go home. I couldn't. The very thought of walking back into that house, the one filled with framed family photos, pretending we were whole, made my stomach turn. Instead, I rented a small room above a bakery with the help of a social worker who had seen too many patients abandoned the way I was. The room was tiny, the wallpaper peeling, and the floor creaked under every step. But it was mine, and no one could walk away from me there. I spent months rebuilding my strength, but I also spent those nights digging into legal avenues. It started with research, Googling medical abandonment, guardianship laws, financial responsibility statutes. What I found both horrified and fueled me. My parents hadn't just left me morally, they had crossed lines legally too. They had tried to dodge responsibility for my care by falsifying parts of the insurance paperwork, signing statements that I had other guardians willing to assume medical costs. Those lies left a trail of documents, and every signature, every false claim became another nail in the coffin of their carefully polished reputation. I knew my father cared more about appearances than anything else. His world was his law firm. His reputation as the man who did everything by the book, the man people trusted with their businesses. My mother's world was the country club, the charity events, the carefully curated image of a nurturing, refined woman who always put family first. They had built their entire lives around masks, and I was about to rip those masks away. I reached out to a lawyer recommended by my therapist, a woman who specialized in family law but had also handled medical neglect cases. When I laid out the files, the copies of documents I'd been quietly collecting, her eyes narrowed, and she asked me one question. "Are you ready for how ugly this will get?" I told her I'd already lived through the ugliest part. What came next couldn't scare me. From there, everything moved like a slow, grinding wheel. Depositions, subpoenas, more documents unearthed. My parents had not only abandoned me in a coma, but had shifted assets out of joint accounts to avoid being tied to my hospital bills. They wanted me forgotten and financially erased. I sat in that lawyer's office listening to every detail, every maneuver they had made. And instead of crying, I wrote it all down in my journal. Not because I needed to remember. I would never forget. But because I wanted every single fact in black and white, like evidence in a trial. And slowly, piece by piece, the case built itself. I was quiet about it, never posting a word on social media, never letting gossip spread back to them. I wanted the first time they saw me to be in a place they couldn't escape. In the meantime, I rebuilt myself further. I signed up for community college classes online, not because I was ready to chase dreams yet, but because I wanted to prove to myself that my brain hadn't been broken, that I could still think, still learn, still move forward. Late nights found me balancing textbooks and legal files, my heart pounding with the knowledge that I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing. And then came the day when my lawyer told me the hearing date was set. I sat with the letter in my hands, staring at the words that felt heavier than anything I had carried before, the courtroom where I would face them. I imagined their faces when I walked in, no longer fragile or erased, but standing on my own 2 feet, living proof that the daughter they abandoned wasn't gone. That image kept me awake at night, but it also gave me the strength to keep going. They thought I was their past mistake buried in a hospital bed. What they didn't know was that I was their future reckoning, and the reckoning was closer than they ever expected. The morning of the court date. I woke before dawn, not because of nerves, but because my body had been conditioned through months of therapy to wake early and fight for progress. I sat on the edge of the bed in that small rented room above the bakery, the smell of rising bread seeping through the floorboards, and I thought about how far I'd come from the silence of that hospital room. My lawyer had told me I didn't have to appear in person, that my presence wasn't required for the first hearing, but I insisted. I needed to be there. I needed them to see me, not just hear my name through legal documents. I wanted the shock of my survival to be the first crack in their armor. I remember pulling on the navy dress I had bought secondhand, carefully pressing out the wrinkles, applying my makeup with steady hands, even though my reflection still carried faint shadows of the coma I had survived. I wanted to look strong, but not theatrical, present, but not broken. When I stepped outside, the morning air was cold and sharp, filling my lungs with the kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The courthouse itself felt sterile, its high ceilings echoing with footsteps and murmurs, the scent of coffee and paper mixing in the air. I sat quietly beside my lawyer, my hands folded in my lap, and I focused on my breathing while we waited. And then they walked in. My parents entered through the double doors like royalty accustomed to control. The perfect posture, the expensive clothes, my mother's pearls glinting under the fluorescent lights. They carried themselves as though this was another charity event, another minor inconvenience they would smooth over with practiced smiles. They didn't even glance toward me at first. Why would they? In their minds, I wasn't supposed to exist anymore. I wasn't supposed to be strong enough to rise from that bed, much less stand against them. But then my father's gaze drifted, casual at first, and landed on me. For a heartbeat, his face didn't change. And then the color drained so suddenly, I thought he might collapse right there in front of the judge. My mother followed his line of sight, her lips parting as if to whisper my name, but no sound came out. The woman who had once braided my hair, who once called me her miracle baby, looked at me as though she'd seen a ghost claw its way out of the ground. That silence was worth every sleepless night, every step of agony and physical therapy, every moment of loneliness in that peeling walled room above the bakery. Because in that moment, I wasn't just their discarded child, I was living proof of their betrayal. And they knew it. The judge entered, the clerk called the case, and I watched their carefully constructed world begin to unravel thread by thread. My lawyer presented the documents, the forged signatures, the financial transfers, the proof of abandonment. Every piece of evidence was like a hammer striking glass, each crack spreading wider across the mask of perfection my parents had worn for decades. My father tried to interject, his voice carrying that familiar edge of authority he had used my whole life to silence me, but the judge cut him off sharply, reminding him that he was not above the law. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, trying to summon sympathy, but every person in that room saw her for what she was. Sat there, silent and composed, not because I wasn't feeling anything, but because I refused to let them see me shake. Inside my heart was pounding, every beat echoing with years of neglect and pain. But outwardly, I gave them nothing. No tears, no anger, no desperation, just quiet strength. And the more I stayed calm, the more their performance fell apart. My father's voice grew louder, more desperate, contradicting himself, his words tangling in anger. My mother's sobs turned shrill, her mask cracking with every false word. And I knew then, in that sterile courtroom filled with strangers and officials, that the power had shifted. They no longer controlled the narrative. They no longer defined who I was. I wasn't their burden, their inconvenience, their erased mistake. I was their consequence, and for the first time in my life, they were the ones who couldn't run away. The hearing stretched on for hours, and every moment peeled back another layer of the carefully constructed lie my parents had wrapped themselves in. My lawyer brought out evidence piece by piece, not rushing, letting each revelation settle like a heavy stone in the room. Bank transfers showing how they funneled money out of joint accounts days after my accident, insurance forms with signatures that claimed guardianship responsibilities had been transferred to relatives who didn't exist. Emails between my father and his financial advisor, where he referred to my condition as a problem to be managed discreetly. Each exhibit was projected on the courtroom screen, stark black and white proof of their betrayal. I kept my eyes on them, watching the way my father's jaw tightened until the muscles quivered, the way my mother's manicured fingers twisted her pearl necklace so hard I thought the string would snap. They avoided looking at me, as if meeting my gaze would turn them to stone, but every so often, their eyes darted in my direction involuntarily, as though they couldn't believe I was real. My lawyer asked me to take the stand. The room fell, silent as I rose, steady despite the tremor in my legs, and walked to the witness chair. My hand shook slightly as I swore the oath, but my voice was firm when I began to speak. I told them what it felt like to wake up alone in that hospital room, how the nurses whispered that my parents had left, how I listened to strangers tend to me while my family vacationed and attended galas. I spoke about the silence of my phone, the absence of messages, the emptiness that settled heavier on me than the weight of any injury. I described how it felt to see my name erased from documents, how my existence had been reduced to a line item they wanted off their ledger. My voice cracked only once, when I said aloud for the first time, "They tried to declare me a burden they no longer had to carry." The judge leaned forward then, his expression grave, while the courtroom gallery remained utterly still. When I finished, I looked directly at my parents. My father's face was flushed red, his fists clenched, his mouth a tight line. My mother had tears streaming down her cheeks, but I didn't recognize them as genuine. They weren't the tears of a mother who had lost sleep at her daughter's bedside. They were the tears of a woman watching her facade collapse in front of an audience she once charmed. For once, I didn't feel small in their presence. I didn't feel like the child begging for scraps of attention, or the inconvenience they sighed about behind closed doors. I felt powerful, not because I had destroyed them yet, but because they could no longer deny me. My existence, my voice, my survival, they had to sit there and witness it. Cross-examination was brutal. My father's lawyer tried to twist my words, implying I was exaggerating, suggesting my parents had been misinformed or acting out of shock. But I had prepared for this. Every journal entry, every hospital record, every time-stamped file was in my hands. I answered calmly, without theatrics, and each time I corrected their lawyer with hard evidence, I saw another crack form in my parents' defense. The gallery shifted, murmuring softly, people recognizing the truth beneath the surface. And though I didn't smile, inside I felt a quiet satisfaction. This was no longer my word against theirs. This was fact against fiction, truth against facade, and truth was winning. When the judge finally called a recess, my parents stood, their eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine, clinging to each other like cornered animals. My lawyer leaned over and whispered, "They didn't expect you to be this strong. They thought they could bury you in silence." I nodded, my hands steady now, my breath even, because she was right. They had gambled on my weakness, on my silence, and lost. And as I watched them retreat into the hallway, their shoulders hunched. Under the weight of exposure, I knew this was only the beginning. They had built their lives on appearances, but appearances couldn't save them now. They had abandoned me when I was helpless, and now, when I stood stronger than ever, they were the ones who couldn't escape the truth. When the recess ended and we were called back into the courtroom, I noticed a shift in the air. My parents no longer entered with that imperious posture, no longer looked like the untouchable pillars of wealth and grace they had always pretended to be. Their steps were slower, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion, and the whispering in the gallery was no longer admiration, but suspicion. I sat tall at our table, my lawyer flipping through her files with crisp confidence. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking under their gaze. They were shrinking under mine. The judge began by addressing the evidence that had been presented. He spoke in measured tones, but every word was a stone laid onto their shoulders. Abandonment, falsification, asset concealment, medical neglect. Each term was sharp, clinical, undeniable. My father shifted in his seat, attempting to maintain his composure, but I could see his knuckles whiten as he gripped the edge of the table. My mother dabbed at her eyes again, though her tears looked more like a performance than sorrow. And then came the moment that changed everything. The judge called forward a witness, one of the nurses who had cared for me during those long nights in the ICU. She stepped into the courtroom, still in her hospital scrubs, and her voice shook only slightly as she told the court how she had searched the waiting rooms, expecting to find my family, but they were never there. How she had tried calling the emergency numbers on file and received no answer. How she had been the one to hold my hand and talk to me when the machines beeped in warning. How she had whispered that I wasn't alone, even though my parents had made sure I was. I sat frozen, listening to her words pierce through the walls my parents had built. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't emotional. She was factual, steady, and every sentence chipped away at the illusion my parents still tried to cling to. My mother shifted uncomfortably, her tears drying on her cheeks, while my father's jaw twitched as though he wanted to interrupt but knew he couldn't. When the nurse finished, she glanced at me briefly and I mouthed a quiet, "Thank you." That simple moment between us carried more genuine love than anything I had ever received from my family. The opposing lawyer tried to paint the abandonment as a misunderstanding, claiming my parents had been misled, that they thought my care was being transferred elsewhere. But the nurse shook her head firmly. "They weren't misled," she said. "They signed the papers and left. We all knew it." That silence that followed her testimony was deafening. My parents' world, built on appearances and polished lies, was cracking loudly in a room full of witnesses, and then the judge turned to me. "Do you have anything you wish to say before we move forward?" My throat tightened, but I forced myself to meet his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice was steady, almost eerily calm. I told him I wasn't seeking pity, that I wasn't standing there to gain sympathy from the court. What I wanted was recognition of the truth, that my parents had chosen to abandon me when I was powerless, that they had lied to cover their tracks, and that their actions had left scars deeper than any injury from my accident. I said, "They wanted to erase me, but I survived, and I stand here not to destroy them out of vengeance, but because I will not allow what they did to be hidden." The gallery stirred, and even the judge's expression softened, though he quickly masked it with professional composure. My parents' lawyer tried to rally one last defense, citing their emotional distress, their confusion, their grief. But the evidence on the record was louder than excuses, and the cracks in their facade had widened into chasms. My father, once the commanding presence in every room, now sat hunched, staring down at the table as though the polished wood might swallow him whole. My mother clutched his arm, her hand trembling, her eyes darting from me to the judge to the gallery, as if searching for someone, anyone, to side with them. No one did. When the judge finally adjourned for the day, his voice was clear. The case would continue, with full investigation into the abandonment, the falsified documents, and the concealed assets. My parents had hoped to walk in, intimidate, charm, and walk out unscathed. Instead, they were leaving with the weight of the law pressing down on them, and the knowledge that the daughter they tried to bury was standing stronger than ever. As they shuffled out, avoiding eye contact with anyone, I remained seated, my back straight, my hands folded neatly. I didn't need to chase them with words or glares. They knew. They felt it. For the first time, they were the ones being left behind, powerless and exposed. And for the first time, I understood what it meant to take back control of a story that was always supposed to be mine. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, hearings, and endless preparation. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a steady current of strength running through me, something I had never felt before. My parents tried every tactic they knew, denial, gaslighting, rewriting history, but each move only tightened the noose of their own lies. My father filed motions claiming I was unstable, that my accident had left me mentally unfit to testify, but the court-appointed psychiatrist's report came back crystal clear. I was coherent, rational, and very aware of the events surrounding me. When that report was read aloud, I saw my father's face collapse for the briefest second. A man who had always believed his words could bend reality. This time, they couldn't. My mother, on the other hand, tried to play the victim. She cried in depositions, claimed she had been misled by her husband, insisted she never wanted to leave me but felt pressured. Yet, the bank records told a different story. Her name was on every transaction. Her signature sat bold and clean on the paperwork that tried to erase me. My lawyer would slide those documents across the table, and the tears would dry instantly, replaced by silence that filled the room heavier than her sobs ever could. Outside the courtroom, their world began to crumble. My father's firm issued a quiet statement about his leave of absence, but everyone in the industry knew what it meant. Clients pulled contracts, whispers of fraud and abandonment spread faster than he could contain them. My mother found herself unwelcome at luncheons and charity events, her friends suddenly too busy to return calls. The very people they had abandoned me to impress were now watching them unravel, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Through all of it, I kept moving forward. I attended every session of therapy, strengthened my body step by painful step, and reminded myself every morning why I was fighting. There were nights when the memories of the hospital haunted me, when I'd wake drenched in sweat, convinced I could still hear the machines beeping and warning with no one at my side. But then I'd open my journal, reread the words I had written to myself, and remember, I survived. I was here. They no longer defined me. The turning point came during the third week of testimony. My lawyer presented a timeline, my accident, my hospitalization, the exact dates of their financial transfers, and then, projected on the courtroom screen, photos of my parents smiling at a beach resort just 7 days after signing the documents to release me. The contrast was damning. The gallery gasped, the judge's face hardened, and for the first time, I let myself look directly at those photos. I studied my mother's wide-brimmed hat, my father's sunglasses, their cocktails, raised high, their smiles beaming. It was as if I had never existed, as if my coma had been a minor inconvenience they had shaken off like a bad dream. My chest ached, but not from pain, from a fire so deep it steadied me. The judge asked if I had a response to the evidence. I stood, my legs steady, my hands folded calmly, and I said, "That week, while they sipped drinks on a beach, a nurse had to resuscitate me twice. Strangers fought for my life while my family posed for photos. I think that says more than I ever could." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of my mother's muffled sob and my father's pen snapping in half between his fingers. By the time court adjourned that day, the case was no longer about misunderstandings or paperwork. It was about survival versus abandonment, truth versus lies. And for once, I was no longer the girl lying helpless in a hospital bed. I was the woman standing in front of them, turning their own choices into the mirror they could no longer avoid. Every time I stepped out of that courthouse, the press would snap photos, their questions swirling in the air, and while I never answered, I held my head high. Not because I wanted the attention, but because I wanted the world to see me as I truly was. Unbroken, unafraid, and unwilling to ever let my parents bury me again. And as the final hearing approached, I could see it written across their faces. Every time we locked eyes in that courtroom, they were terrified. Not of losing money, not of losing status, but of losing the one thing they thought they would always control, me. And that was the sweetest justice of all. The final phase of the trial was nothing short of brutal, a drawn-out dissection of everything my parents had tried to hide. By then, the gallery was often packed, reporters slipping in with notebooks, strangers whispering as my name spread beyond the courthouse walls. I wasn't there for notoriety, but I realized how much my parents despised the attention. The very thing they once courted now turned against them. My father arrived each morning with deep lines etched into his face, his once sharp suits hanging looser on his frame. My mother wore darker colors now, as if she could disappear into the background, but she never could, not with the spotlight shining so fiercely on their deceit. The prosecution presented their final witnesses, hospital administrators, and financial officers who walked the court through every inconsistency. They showed how my parents had signed forms authorizing my discharge before doctors recommended it, how they had pressured billing departments to reclassify my status to non-dependent in order to dodge financial liability. There were emails where my father wrote, "If she doesn't make it, it's better for everyone. Don't drag this out." Hearing those words aloud in a courtroom, seeing them projected in black and white, felt like a knife twisting in my gut. But I didn't look away. I wanted the court to see me sitting there, silent but unflinching, a living contradiction to their wish that I had simply died quietly. When it came time for the defense, they scrambled. My father's lawyer tried to paint a picture of a family under immense stress, of decisions made in haste and grief. He gestured toward my parents, calling them confused but loving, people who had been overwhelmed by tragedy. But every word fell flat against the mountain of evidence. My father sat rigid, his jaw set, refusing to look at me while my mother cried into a handkerchief, her sobs carefully timed yet somehow hollow, the sound of a performance that no longer fooled anyone. Then came the moment my lawyer had prepared me for: closing statements. She spoke with precision, her voice rising and falling like waves against a cliff. She described how I had been abandoned at my weakest, how my parents' choices had not only endangered me, but had been deliberate, calculated. "This is not a case of grief-clouding judgment," she said firmly, pointing to the exhibits stacked high on the table. "This is a case of erasure, of parents who signed their child away as if she were a burden, and then carried on with their lives while strangers fought to keep her alive." Her words echoed through the chamber, and I felt tears sting my eyes. Not for myself, but because finally the truth was being spoken in a place where it mattered. And then the judge asked if I wished to make a statement before deliberation. My lawyer squeezed my hand, a silent reminder that I didn't have to, that I'd already done enough. But I knew I needed to. I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and I turned not to the judge, but to my parents. My voice was steady as I said, "When I was a child, I used to believe family was unconditional, that no matter what happened, my parents would be there. Lying in that hospital bed, fighting for my life, I learned that wasn't true. You left me. You erased me. And now, here we are, not in our home, not in whispers behind closed doors, but in court, because the truth couldn't stay buried." I paused, letting the silence press in. "I'm not here to beg for your love or your guilt. I'm here so the world knows what happens when the people you trust most choose convenience over compassion. I survived in spite of you, not because of you." For the first time, I saw my mother's face crumple, not with performance, but with something raw, maybe shame, maybe fear. My father, however, kept his eyes locked forward, unblinking, as though if he didn't move, he could hold on to the last shred of his collapsing power. The judge nodded solemnly, his pen scratching notes across the page, and I returned to my seat with my hands steady in my lap. When the jury deliberated, I sat in that quiet room, the hum of air conditioning above me, and I thought about how far I'd come, from tubes and wires to this moment, where my words carried weight heavier than any silence ever had. Hours later, when the verdict was read, the words confirmed everything I already knew in my bones. They were guilty of abandonment, of fraud, of negligence. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously, but I stayed still, breathing slowly, letting the weight of justice settle. My parents didn't collapse dramatically. Instead, they slumped, drained, stripped of the armor they had worn their entire lives. And for me, that quiet unraveling was more powerful than any outburst could have been. As we left the courtroom, flashes from cameras lit the steps outside, but I didn't shield my face. I looked ahead, my chin high, knowing that this wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the beginning of a life I had reclaimed. My parents had tried to bury me in silence, but I had turned that silence into a voice that could not be ignored. And as they were escorted away, their names forever tied to their betrayal, I walked forward into the noise of the world with the calm of someone who had already survived the worst and emerged unbroken. In the weeks after the verdict, life felt strangely quiet, as though the storm had finally broken and left only clear skies in its wake. My parents disappeared from public life almost immediately. Their house put up for sale, their names scrubbed from charity rosters, my father's once proud law firm severing ties in a carefully worded press release. I heard whispers of bankruptcy, filings, of assets frozen, of social invitations rescinded, but I didn't chase those details. For once, their downfall didn't concern me. It wasn't about watching them lose everything. It was about knowing that what they did could never, again, be hidden behind polished smiles and rehearsed excuses. Justice had branded them, and the mark would never fade. For me, the adjustment was slower. I returned to my small room above the bakery, the scent of warm bread rising through the floorboards, and for the first time, it smelled like safety, not survival. I kept going to therapy, still fought through nights when I woke gasping from nightmares of monitors flatlining and empty chairs at my bedside. Healing wasn't instant, but it was real. I enrolled in more classes, began considering futures I had once thought impossible, and slowly I built a life not defined by abandonment, but by resilience. Strangers began sending me letters, other daughters, sons, even parents who had faced betrayal, who saw in my story a reflection of their own pain. I read every single one, realizing that in surviving and speaking out, I had given a voice to others who still felt silenced. The last time I saw my parents was at a mandatory follow-up hearing months later. They looked smaller somehow, diminished, not just by age, but by shame. My father avoided my gaze entirely, his once commanding presence reduced to a man hunched over his lawyer's notes. My mother glanced at me once, her eyes glassy, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak. But no words came. I didn't speak either. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had already been said in court, carved into the record, of truth they could never erase. When the hearing ended, I walked out first, my steps echoing down the marble corridor, and this time I didn't look back. That night, I returned home, opened my journal, and wrote one final entry about them. They tried to bury me in silence. I became the voice that buried their lies instead. As I closed the book, I realized I no longer needed to write about them. My life could finally be about more than survival, more than the family who abandoned me. It could be about me, about living freely, choosing who I allowed into my circle, building something that was mine alone. And for the first time since I woke in that hospital bed, I felt light, untethered from the weight of their betrayal. The final chapter of this story isn't written in court transcripts or legal files. It's written in the quiet moments I now allow myself to have, the ones where I wake up in the morning and the first thought in my head isn't pain or fear, but possibility. There are still scars, both on my body and in my memory, but they no longer feel like open wounds. They feel like proof that I endured what should have broken me, proof that I survived when those who should have stood beside me turned their backs. I still walk past hospitals sometimes and feel my chest tighten, still flinch at the sound of a monitor beeping on a television show, but I remind myself that I am no longer the girl lying alone in that bed. I am the woman who stood in front of her parents and refused to be erased. People ask me sometimes if I regret taking them to court, if part of me wishes I had stayed silent to avoid the spectacle. My answer never wavers. Silence was what almost killed me. Speaking, standing, fighting, it gave me my life back. And though the process was grueling, though it forced me to rip open wounds in public, I would do it all again. Because justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about making sure the truth is louder than the lies. My parents will live the rest of their lives under the shadow of what they did. Maybe they will justify it to themselves. Maybe they will drown in regret. Or maybe they will simply pretend none of it happened. But that's no longer my concern. I don't carry them with me anymore. I don't wait for apologies or explanations that will never come. I carry only myself, stronger, steadier, finally free. On the anniversary of the day I woke from my coma, I went back to the small bakery where I first found refuge. I bought a loaf of bread, warm and soft in my hands, and carried it back to my little apartment. As I broke it open and let the steam curl into the air, I realized that survival isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes survival is choosing to keep living quietly, joyfully, even when others tried to take that choice away. So this is where I leave the story. Not at the courthouse, not in the shadow of my parents' collapse, but in the light of my own beginning. I am not the girl they abandoned. I am not the coma patient they signed away. I am not the burden they tried to erase. I am here, alive, unbroken, and unafraid. And if there is one truth I carry forward, it is this. Sometimes the best, revenge is simply refusing to disappear.